Ford introduced its LTD as a top-of-the-line Galaxie 500 trim in 1965, and the vehicle sold over 100,000 units in its inaugural model year. As a result, Ford thought the LTD was a huge success and continued to pump money into the franchise and develop it into an increasingly handsome automobile. Perhaps one of the most handsome LTDs, or even the most handsome ever produced, is the 1968 LTD that you see here. In its final years, more specifically after the 1979 model year, the LTD would be known as a rather boxy vehicle with flat fenders, flat belt line, and just overall not that visually interesting. But for 1968, the LTD received all new sheet metal and an all new roofline. And there are a number of great features about the 1968 LTD and specifically the 1968 LTD Brougham. Let's talk about the top 5 items, features, quirks, idiosyncrasies, whatever you want to call it, of the 1968 LTD Brougham. And at number 5, we have the 1968 LTD's new sleek 4-door hardtop design. Now, by 1968, 4-door hardtops were really nothing new, but the 1968 LTD and this 1968 LTD Brougham provided an extremely handsome new roofline on this 4-door hardtop body style. When the LTD was introduced in 1965 and also in the 1966 and 1967 model years, the roofline of the overall 4-door hardtop, as well as the body sides of the vehicle, were kind of upright and stiff, somewhat like the headlights were in those years. But by 1968, Ford designers had placed a new roofline on both the 4-door hardtop as well as the 2-door. And I have to say, many people say, well, 4-door cars, that's 2 doors too many. But at least in my opinion, the 4-door 1968 LTD is the better looking vehicle of the 4-door and the 2-door hardtop. Ford changed the roofline on the 1968 LTD on the 2 doors and went to a more formal upright backlight on those vehicles compared to the more fastbacky 1967 roofline, which was only a 1-year roofline on the Fords, although it would continue on for one more model year in 1968 on the Mercury Marquis. But for 1968, this roofline that was shared between Ford and Mercury on the 4-door hardtops, I think, is just a sublime-looking roofline. That rear backlight isn't too stiff and isn't too fastbacky for the vehicle, and it just has a great overall look and open and airy feel. For me, the 2-door 1968 LTD just looks a bit stiff, especially when you compare it with the beautiful 1967 2-door and, frankly, the 1968 Mercury 2-door, which kept that roofline. I don't know why Ford decided that the LTD needed a change to something that really didn't look nearly as good, but they did. In any event, personally, I think the 4-door LTD is the one to get, but you let me know in the comments section what you think. Next, let's move on to number 4, and that's the 1968 LTD's hidden headlights in their inaugural year. As I just mentioned, this was the first year for hidden headlights on the LTD. In 1965 through 7, they had the stacked headlight theme, as you previously saw. And the hidden headlights would last just a few model years, 1968, 1969, and 1970, before in 1971 the LTD would revert back to exposed headlights and really would keep those exposed headlights for a number of years until the Landau Luxury Group would be introduced on the LTD in the mid-1970s. But at least for my money, I would say the hidden headlights on the 68 are the most dramatic and I think the best looking. For not only do you get hidden headlights, but you get this awesome grille that really disguises the headlamp doors. It's this rectangle within a rectangle theme. And I think it gives the front end a very dramatic flair. And I also love the Ford badge on the driver's side headlamp door that's, of course, also in the shape of a, you guessed it, rectangle. So the hidden headlights on the 68 LTD, I think, are the most dramatic of any of them. And the overall front end is just a menacing-looking front end. I also happen to like how the turn signals and parking lights are incorporated into the front fender form, really continuing the shape of the sheet metal into the cornering light. They don't look like they're just tacked on and they're not hidden away in the bumper, as an example. And, of course, on this vehicle, they also serve another function that is as of side marker lights. And another strange fact about these hidden headlights is that while the LTD got the hidden headlights, the Mercury did not. None of the Mercuries, whether it was a Monterey, Montclair, Park Lane, Brome, Marquis. So the cheaper vehicles in the FOMOCO lineup, these LTDs, ended up getting the hidden headlights. Although it is true the Galaxies did not have the hidden headlights or the customs. But if you got an LTD, you got hidden headlights. If you got a Mercury, you didn't. And by the way, the Mercury grille also looks like it would have had a nice look with hidden headlights, kind of like the Cougar would have. But oh well, let's move on to number 3, and that is the engine choices that you could get in this 1968 LTD. Now, many 1968 LTDs were equipped with Ford's 302 cubic inch V8, which was standard in the LTDs, and it made 210 horsepower and breathed through an Autolite 2100 two-barrel carburetor. Amazingly, for a full-size car, if you've driven one of these with a 302, it is an absolute gem of an engine. I don't know how Ford did it. It is so smooth, it's so quiet, and it actually is not a slug. It doesn't have much in terms of horsepower, but overall torque and throttle response in the 302 cars is actually really, really good. And frankly, if I had been shopping for one during that era, I don't know that I would have upgraded beyond the 302 because it was just so smooth and an excellent V8. By the way, the Ford 302, interestingly, shares its 4-inch bore and 3-inch stroke with the Pontiac 301 cubic inch V8 and even General Motors Iron Duke, although obviously there's nothing that's the same between them. One up from the 302 cubic inch V8 was the 390 cubic inch V8, the Ford FE or Ford Edsel engine that made 265 horsepower and breathed through a two-barrel carburetor. This was the entry-level 390 cubic inch V8. There was another 390 cubic inch V8 that was premium fuel and breathed through a four-barrel carburetor that made 315 horsepower. And then the top engine in the LTDs was the FE Series 428 cubic inch V8 that made 340 horsepower. So you could get a whole range of engines in your LTD from 210 to 340 horsepower and power it just as you saw fit. In the Mercuries, the 390 cubic inch V8 would be standard with either the 265 or 315 horsepower, depending upon which series you bought, and the 428 would also be optional. But really, regardless of what engine you selected, you got an excellent motor under hood in your 1968 LTD. The 390s, the 428s, and as I mentioned, the 302s, all super smooth, very peppy, reliable, good engines. And they were backed by good transmissions, either the C4, the FMX, or the C6. Most people know about the C4 and C6. The FMX was also a pretty good transmission. It was effectively a Ford Cruise-O-Matic, kind of the old Ford automatic. And it was pretty durable and also had taken really the FX and MX transmissions and combined both of them to get the best of both transmissions in one package. And it worked pretty well. By the way, 1968 was also the first year that Ford put the heat stove on these engines. So you can see the air cleaner has that heat stove that goes down to the exhaust manifold to help it really take in warm air on the cold weather days. That was something, as I mentioned, new for 1968. And this particular 428 that you're seeing here is a California emissions-equipped car. You can see it's got all the air pump lines and everything around it. So a few little factoids about the engines under hood as well. Let's move on to number 2, and that is beautiful interiors in these 1968 LTDs. And we're going to take a look at this LTD Brome, as you see here. Now, the interior for 1968 in these LTDs was new. The instrument panel was new. The door panels redesigned. The interior seat stitch pattern redesigned. And I think the instrument panel, as an example, is just a particularly handsome, simple, mid-century modern-esque design. You see that in that upper section of the instrument panel, you have the fuel gauge, the speedometer, and the radio. And it's kind of arranged in a tasteful manner, all in that pod, somewhat sci-fi-y, I guess I would call it. The steering wheel here, I think, is also handsome. Similar to 1967 and 1968, Fords all had a similar steering wheel, this two-spoke style design. In 1967, the same would be true with Ford's so-called flower pot wheel, but by 1968, the energy-absorbing steering column rendered that, well, not necessary, and they went to this more handsome design with the horn ring below the two-spoke wheel, as you see there. And I love the clock placement on this, right in the middle, right underneath the speedometer. You, of course, can see the shift quadrant on the steering column. That is illuminated at night, by the way, too, so you can see it quite readily. And a nice feature when you put the parking lights on is that there's a light behind the ignition key location, so you can see where to put your ignition key when you're trying to search for it when it's dark. Of course, this being an LTD Brougham, you get the faux burl wood grain on the steering wheel as well as the instrument panel and door panels. And I have to say it's actually somewhat convincing. I'm not a fan of faux burl, but Ford did it really well in these. It's really because it's textured. If you run your hand across the fake wood grain, it's not just perfectly smooth and it's not a sticker, but it actually has texture to it. And it looks quite good. My sense is that Ford really used this synthetic wood, let's call it, in these LTDs for durability reasons, as that would actually even be true in the 1969 Mark III. Before, in 1970, the Mark III would use real wood. Ford was concerned about durability. And as we take a look at the seating, here's a look at some of the buttons and biscuits, if you will, in terms of the overall seating. I like the seat back design that has that kind of biscuit-like look with the buttons, and then the bottom portion just has this, I'll call it regular seat stitch pattern. I think overall it's pretty handsome. And then the door panels, of course, you have the buttons and the biscuit pleating as well on the door panels. Notice the power window switch. This car is equipped with power windows, and it's located in the same location where a normal crank would be if this car were a manual window car. So Ford did save some money by putting the power window switches there. But the doors also have those nice little lights that you can see illuminated. That was really something that was special in this price class when the LTD was introduced. And I think it just gave the door panels a very elegant look. And at least from my perspective, I think the interior in this 1968 LTD could really stand up to almost anything in certainly even the mid-priced price class, like with Oldsmobiles and Pontiacs and Buicks. I think it's especially handsome and tasteful, and it's certainly not a cheap interior. It looks great. Let's move on to number one, and that is the super cool exterior styling of the 68 LTD, including this crown motif and even things like the wheel covers. The 1968 LTD, from an exterior styling standpoint, really is an anomaly during this Jean Bourdonnais era of Ford styling, where as the years would go by under Bourdonnais' tenure, the vehicles would become increasingly boxy and look like so-called three-box designs with the hood, the midsection, and the trunk. Perhaps best exemplified by those Panther platform cars that were introduced in 1979, like the LTD, later Crown Vic, the Grand Marquis, and even the Lincoln Mark VI perhaps best exemplifies the Bourdonnais era of styling at Ford. But for 1968, the stylists really had fun, and I think they had a lot of fun with this vehicle. And let's start at the rear here by taking a look at that LTD badge that's in the middle of the deck lid. And notice the crown motif associated with it. Now pull your gaze back and look at the rear quarter panel tips as well as that ridge running down the deck lid. Do you notice anything? Do you notice that crown motif is actually replicated in the deck lid? Well, it is. And that's just one of the few areas where that crown motif appears on the exterior styling of this LTD. In fact, if you look closely and rotate your head sideways, you'll notice the crown motif is even present in the taillights there, with the midsection of the crown being the reverse light, and then the taillights are scalloped out so that they can form the other portions of the crown. Pretty sweet. Let's look at the front now. Now notice the styling here, and you can see the crown as well with the fender tips, as well as that ridge running down the center line of the hood. Of course, here the hood does have this raised section that's kind of pushed up from underneath that gives it some dimension, but that crown motif is present there, and it's also present in the tips of the fenders there at the end. Take a look and, again, rotate your head sideways and examine the ends of the fender, and you can see the crown motif is there yet again. And if you look at the front from plan view, in other words, from a bird's eye view, look at the bumper. It has that crown motif as well. So the crown motif is really everywhere on the car and even on the body sides. Let's take a look at the body sides now. This particular car has a body side molding, which I wish wasn't there, but it is. But that body side molding is really at the apex of the radius associated with a feature line that replicates the crown. Again, if you rotate your head 90 degrees, that molding, imagine that it's proud of the door section that's immediately around it. So you kind of get that midpoint peak of the crown on that molding. And it's just, again, another beautiful styling element on this car. And here in a final picture, you can see the 68 LTD juxtaposed against my 72 Continental Coupe, which really, at least in my mind, exemplifies the Bourdonnais era of styling at Ford. Notice that super flat fender, flat belt line, and even the kind of bladed fender versus the LTD that has a bit more gesture and form to it. The body sides are more curved. And again, you have that interesting motif that runs throughout the exterior styling on the LTD. So for those reasons, I just think the 1968 LTD, and in particular the 68 LTD Brougham, is really just a special car. And I suppose other buyers thought so as well, because in 1968, Ford sold quite a few of these. They sold 62,000 of these hardtop sedans, 54,000 hardtop coupes, and then 22,000 pillared sedans. So overall, around 140-ish thousand units. But let me know in the comments section what you like best about the 1968 LTD, or whatever favorite car that you have. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care.